Okay, so and thanks for having me. Glad to be here today. Roxana, I don't know. I'm sure something is important going on with her, but I'm able to handle all the stuff that we were going to talk about until she gets here. So, unpermitted conditions. Uh, they're a big issue with realtors because they tend to come up. Well, they come up in escrow more often than not. So most of the time I get brought in during an escrow because that's when the condition came up. And because it's in the middle of an escrow, it's a crisis immediately. The escrows are shorter and shorter these days, so it's a bigger and bigger crisis now than it has been in the past. And we're brought in when the usually a buyer is who brings us in. Like an issue will come up and the buyer's agent will call us and say, hey, this came up, especially now when sellers aren't really having to offer any sort of extensions or concessions or anything. The buyers really want to know, okay, I'm going to be inheriting this potential issue. What does it mean for me? What kind of risk am I taking here? And they call on people like me or Roxana to tell them that. So what can you look for that would trigger the need for services like ours? I would say the first thing you should look for, the number one red flag for me, is if you were to ask a seller or a property owner, hey, do you know if this is permitted or not? And they say, to the best of my understanding, it is. That is a virtual guarantee that it is not permitted. And furthermore, that they know it's not permitted. Anybody that knows that something's permitted will absolutely tell you 100% this is permitted, because that's really valuable and it would immediately dispel any concerns you have. To my understanding, it means I am not giving you the whole truth, or I'm not being accurate with you. I guess there are some people who really don't know if it's permitted or not. But that's the number one red flag for me is if I'm on a site and I ask some seller's agent or the owner themselves, if they're there, hey, what do you know about this? And they say, oh, well, to my understanding, it's permitted. Then I know for sure it's probably not. The next things to look for would be if you're looking at a house and you see sort of, houses are built as rectangles usually. They're especially older houses like on the Mesa, because that's how it's cheap to build a house. So it'll be a rectangle. It might have another little rectangle sticking off for the garage or something, but generally they are square. And if you see some sort of a room that's been added to the house that's small dimensions, so we're talking like 10 feet 12 feet by 10 feet, that kind of a thing, sticking off one side of a house, usually the back, look at that more closely. And then look for things like, the things I look for in the field are, does the roof pitch change at that addition? So if you have a 5 to 12 roof pitch, which means it goes up 5 feet in every 12 feet, and then all of a sudden over this little thing sticking off the back of the house, it's flat, or it's a 1 to 12 roof pitch or something, that's telling you that this is something that was built by other than the original builder, and it may or may not have been permitted. That's not a guarantee that it's unpermitted, but it is something that would clue you in that it might not be permitted. Another thing to look for is siding breaks. So when they build a house, it generally has the same siding all the way around, stucco, slat siding, board and bat, whatever, all the way around the house. And if that little thing sticking off the house has a different type of siding on it, or if it's all, let's say it was all flat siding and it's all going along like this, but right where that little thing is, there's a vertical board going through it. you need to think to yourself, why is that there? Why would somebody put this vertical board right here in the siding in a place that sure lines up with what that original roof pitch looks like? Well, that's because that's where the original corner of the house was, and this thing was built on afterwards. And so again, that doesn't guarantee you that it is unpermitted, but it certainly tells you, look closely at it. And then, I guess another thing that's really easy to spot would be if you're in the house and you see a break in the floor. So like not just the floor covering, but an actual vertical break in the floor. So if you're in the family room and then the floor comes down like this 6 inches, and then like this cool dining room's down here, you got to wonder, why is the floor breaking by 6 inches just in that room? And again, if these things, look at them as a whole. If that break also corresponds to where that roof is different on the outside and the siding is different on the outside, that thing was added on, and most likely it was done without permits, because when professionals do these types of additions, we tend to tie these things in so that the floor is flat all the way through the house. Whereas when Joe homeowner does it on the weekend with his buddies, he's not thinking about, oh, this what's it going to be like that my floor is not all the same thing. And then finally, the other thing to really look for is ceiling heights. Like building code requires a 7-foot ceiling height minimum in almost every case. And so if you're in a part of a house that looks like it's been added on and the ceiling is less than 7 feet, that is a virtual guarantee that that was illegally added, because building departments don't permit living space with less than a 7-foot ceiling. So those would be some really big, easy red flags that most agents would be able to spot in the field on their own. And then if you see things like that, that's when you know to do some further research yourself at the agency, or call somebody like myself or Roxana to check that out for you.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. And we now have Roxana Bonderson with us, co-panelist. So I'm going to go right to an introduction of Roxana. And then Roxana, we're going to tee up for you to comment on overlays. What are they and how can they affect the property? But first, let me let the membership know a bit about your background. Roxana Bonderson has a master's of architecture with specialization in urban design and sustainability. She wears many hats in Santa Barbara as an architectural land use planner, as principal planner of Power Planning Services, LLC, a City of Santa Barbara planning commissioner as well, and the executive director of World Healer, which is a 501c3 nonprofit raising global awareness in K-12 classrooms and providing youth leadership and entrepreneurship training. Starting her architectural career in 1992 in Santa Barbara, Roxana then studied and worked abroad for 12 years before returning home to Santa Barbara. After working as an architectural designer, she transitioned into planning at the County of Santa Barbara's Planning and Development Department, learning how to process applications from the public sector standpoint. Understanding both the public and private sector has given Roxana distinctive comprehension on how to strategize and assist applicants to find solutions and process challenging projects. She prides herself on helping homeowners as well as architects, contractors, realtors who come to her for guidance and project management to expedite projects. Also, it's important to note that in addition to the planning consultations, renovations, and accessory dwelling unit development and design, Roxana's focus has been to support families dealing with abating violations on their properties, especially when the owners were sincerely unaware of those violations and feeling overwhelming concern about the pressures of enforcement. She offers support system in addition to gracefully aggressive, I like that term, gracefully aggressive. Maybe we'll have to have her talk more about that. Gracefully aggressive management style that often ends in best case scenarios for the team. Welcome, Roxana. And as we go to you to talk about overlays, what are they and how can they affect a property? Just a reminder to everyone to please, if you're not speaking and Right now, it's just going to be Roxana. Please mute yourself so we can minimize the background noise. Thanks so much. Roxana, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. It's so nice to be here. Please excuse me for running a little bit late. Sometimes those things are out of your control. So what are we doing? Sorry about that, excuse me. So I wanted to just jump right in and talk about overlays. I wanted to share with you that a lot of what I've noticed is a lot of us often don't recognize how much goes into the very first steps of understanding a property by simply looking at the first step, which is often a parcel history, a permit history by parcel report. I have one here, which is very hard to see on a screen, but it looks something like this from the county. And this is often the very first thing that you should do, that we should do, that anyone should do when they're looking at their property to get to know what it looks like from a permitting or legal standpoint. And right at the top of that document, it lists the overlays. It happens to be in the first section right here at the top. And some things are blank, which is really good news, which means that there's not an overlay triggered for your property. But a lot of the time, regardless of what jurisdiction you're in, you will fall into a certain number of these overlays. Most common is ESH, that's environmentally sensitive habitat. Often we might be near a creek or a water system or even just a drainage system, which is considered a waterway. And so those are really important to think about when you're looking at a property for whatever purpose you plan to be looking at it for. I've noticed also in a lot of projects, there are other types of overlays that we might not be immediately privy to from a public standpoint. I can tell you that the different agencies have different types of programs, like PhotoMapper, which is an internal mapping system. They just toggle a bunch of things that they want to see. Perhaps they've been triggered, their curiosity has been triggered by the permit history by parcel document. And so they'll turn things on to see sort of where they land on the property. And a lot of the times they could be completely a tiny, tiny little sliver along the edge of a property, but it still triggers setbacks or 100-year flood perimeters and so on. And so a lot of those things are important when you're developing a property, and also when you're just trying to understand exactly what you may or may not be able to do on a property. Most recently, I can give you an example. Most recently, I was asked to assess a property for sale. And by looking at permit history by parcel, we found that there was a new, somewhat new FEMA overlay in Montecito, where the Thomas fire led to the flood. They've turned on a FEMA overlay in addition to the creek setbacks. So a lot of the time, things are new and we have to sort of learn and adjust based on the environment and the season and what's going on in our community. But those things may not have affected the property when the property was being developed. And it's really important to think about those things, because if someone's trying to develop, or if someone is perhaps hit with a violation, a lot of the time those kind of things tend to be considered legal non-conforming structures that then would sort of grandfather in some of the development. The last thing I just want to add with regard to this is that depending on the jurisdiction or the agency you're working with, they also use a overlaying mapping system called ArcGIS, which I believe is now available to the public, although they often are glitchy and are very difficult to use. And in the end, you end up calling up a planner, you call up the desk, the counter staff, and ask them to help you. But they're getting better. you know, things are getting better as we have been separated and we're online for everything these days. But
Thank you so much,
wraps it up.
Roxanne. That's great. That's a great starting point. Now I'm gonna turn back to Jarrett, and I'd like Jarrett for you to talk about how things have changed since the removal of the zoning information inspection report in the city of Santa Barbara.
Okay, so I think most people are familiar with Santa Barbara Association of Realtors work over 10 plus years to get rid of the ZIR as we know it. Technically, we still have ZIRs, but all it is now is a disclosure link, which is, it should have just been disclosures all along, because we all know the nightmare of ZIRs. So the biggest difference now is issues used to be raised by ZIRs more often than not because, you know, sellers weren't anxious to go figure out what they had unpermitted and disclose it to buyers. It was sort of like, well, it's better if I don't know, and then I don't have to tell you. And then it was the city that came up with it, and then everybody had to deal with it anyway. It's just, the truth sort of has a way of coming out. What's happened since those have been gone, it's been a while now, so things have really adjusted. I've noticed that there is far more effort, both by sellers and buyers, going in to dig up permit issues themselves. Like everybody's just, you know, the city had always claimed that, oh, this is a service to buyers, you know, because it discloses things. And you know, that's debatable. In a way it was, because the city would bring things up, but the problem was that a lot of the stuff they'd bring up wasn't right. Like it actually wasn't a violation. And so that's sort of like over disclosure and false disclosure. So now the onus has gone on to the sellers and the buyers, and they hire people like Roxana and I to basically do the work that the city was doing before. But we do it accurately. We have a lot more at stake than, you know, a city person who just said, you know, basically like they would just say, hey, if you don't know, just call it a violation, no problem, you covered yourself. Whereas there's no way I'm going to do that, because that's going to create a huge problem for people. As you know, especially if my client is the seller, I'm certainly not going to say, well, hey, I don't know, so let's say it's unpermitted. And same with buyers. You know, buyers don't want to have, escrows are stressful enough, and they don't want to have issues brought up that really aren't issues. And so, you know, Roxana and I and others like us, we do our best to really, you know, we're either sure something's an issue or we are sure it's not. And if we don't know, we will tell you it is unclear. And so you've got really good, accurate information to make decisions on. And then the one real benefit of having people like us do it versus the city is that it's your information, it's confidential. Like when we see something that we think's a violation, we don't open an enforcement case. We don't tell the city about it. We tell you about it, and it's between you and your buyer or you and your seller, how to handle it between yourselves. And that's a huge benefit as compared to what was going on before. And I think it really makes it a true disclosure issue. I think if a seller specifically has hired somebody like Roxana or I to evaluate their property pre-market, they're really protecting themselves. They have gone as far as they can to understand if there's unpermitted issues, and then they're disclosing them to any buyer. And I believe it really protects your sellers in the future if anything is to come up with something like that, that they made their absolute best effort to disclose everything. And I would say, you know, since we're right on this topic, I recommend to everybody, when you're gonna list a property, you should include this kind of thing in your preparation to go to market, the same way you'd hire stagers. This is stuff you want to know about before you go on the market. You don't want to find out about it during an escrow. and then you've got a buyer with their hand out looking for concessions. And today you could maybe tell that buyer, well, too bad, I have 5 backup buyers. But things aren't always going to be like that, and I still think it's smoother for you and your buyer or your seller in the transaction to just know this stuff up front and know what your liabilities are going into it.
Thanks so much, Jarrett.
Deborah?
Yeah, and then we're going to move to Jarrett's next item as well. Yes, Roxana?
If it's okay, I'd like to piggyback a little, an important thought off of what Jarrett just said. It's always really important. I encourage everyone to consider getting a planner. It doesn't have to be us, but to get a planner for this kind of stuff, because a lot of the time when information is brought to your attention, it may not actually be accurate. What I have found in my work in these investigations, I like to call it, is a lot of the time when there looks like there might be an enforcement case, or there might be a open permit, it's often the reason is often because the city or the county have not archived and documented properly in their database. And it's no fault to anyone in particular. It's just that at some point in the past, when all the paper files got moved into the computer database, some things got overlooked, or some dates were not put in accurately. And so a lot of the times when I am approached with this kind of concern, I have often found that multiple
hold on, Roxana. Okay.
Yeah.
We had, I think Steve Brown was having difficulty there with the muting. Yes, go ahead and close out, Roxana, and then I'm going to move us along. Yeah, in the interest of time. Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to finish this thought because I think it affects everyone who's listening here today. The fact is that a lot of times the documentation isn't aligned, or the dates haven't been put in properly because the computer does a default, and all of a sudden the date is 1111 all the way across, and it's not a real date. We see that all the time, by the way, or zeros. And so that just leads us to know that we have to go and do a little further inspection and investigation. And there's oftentimes more than not, there is microfiche, there are archives, although some have been destroyed or lost over the years. And most importantly, it's unfortunately, the burden of proof is on the owner. And it's not just, well, the county lost the documents or the city doesn't have it recorded right. It's the burden ends up being on the owner. And that's why having a little bit of that additional support with people who know how to do this regularly and know where to look and who to talk to and how to be gracefully aggressive really does come in and make a big difference. And so I'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, that's the one thing that hasn't changed. You are still guilty until you prove yourself innocent.
Okay, well, Jarrett, on that note, we're going to now come back to you. Can you tell us briefly, if it's possible to have a brief summary of how permitting is different in the city versus the county, Goleta, Montecito, Summerlin? Are there any highlights you can give our members?
Yeah, so the thing that really changes permitting isn't so much like, are you in Montecito or Summerlin or things like that? I mean, it does to a degree. The biggest thing that makes the difference is what jurisdiction are you in? Mm-hmm. So are you in the city of Santa Barbara, or are you in the unincorporated county of Santa Barbara? That's going to be like the biggest level of difference there is. And people have asked me about this for years, and the way I always describe it is that the city have 1 million rules in the city, but you know what they all are when you go into it. So the rules are published, you can read them, you can comply with them, and then you can embark on the incredibly frustrating, agonizing process of going through and complying with all of them. But at the end of it all, if you follow everything, you're eventually going to end up with a permit. Mm-hmm. The county, they have far fewer rules, but their staff doesn't know what they are. And depending on which staff you get, you'll get a completely different answer. If you ask two different people there, hey, what does this policy mean with respect to this overlay that's on my property? What can I do? You will get two different answers from those people. And I'm not talking about like, oh yeah, one says it's gray and another person says it's dark gray. I'm talking about one person says, oh yeah, no problem with your project, and the other person says, you can't do that project. It's really difficult to get clear answers from staff at the county, and it has to do with the different levels of experience with people at the county and the lack of consistent training of the staff at the county. I think the city does a better job. They're not perfect, but they do a much better job training their staff on things so that the staff can give you much more consistent answers. So those are the biggest differences between the city and the county. And then in the county, you are going to run into differences in different areas of the county because the county has these community specific comprehensive plans. So in Montecito, they have a Montecito community plan. Summerlin has a Summerlin community plan. Toro Canyon has a Toro Canyon plan. But then there's like the rest of the county, which doesn't have those plans, and it's just got the general county comprehensive plan policies. So the thing I would tell like lay people trying to figure out this maze of comprehensive planning issues is if you're in an area that you as realtors or people in the market really identify as a specific area like Montecito, it's probably got a community plan that's specific to it, and you should really look at that. The ones I know of off the top of my head are Summerlin, Toro Canyon, Montecito, Carpinteria Valley is one you might not think about, but they have their own plan.
Mission Canyon.
Mission Canyon, North County, there's Orcutt Community Plan. And then there's Gaviota Community Plan. But, those things they exist, but you wouldn't necessarily know about those unless you were like one of us. But if you're in Montecito or someplace that like buyers would like recognize it as a name brand, you probably got a community plan that's specific to that, and that's a whole nother layer of regulation on top of the regular county regulations. So definitely
Jarrett,
look at those kind of things.
Could you also mention any differentiation with Goleta, city of Goleta? Anything come to mind?
The city of Goleta, they've been around since 2001, right? But they're still a new city. They've had a comprehensive plan since I think 2006. And then just last year, they finally adopted their own zoning ordinance. They were using the county's zoning ordinance up till that time. And for the whole first part of its life, the city of Goleta was impossible to deal with. I wouldn't even work on projects there. And I'm somebody who enjoys working on difficult, messy, and ugly projects. And the city of Goleta, I said, no way, not gonna mess with it. They have changed quite a bit. I always thought it was funny when they formed the city of Goleta with the idea that all they would do was deny development projects. And I said, you guys are going to be surprised that you're approving more development projects than ever would have been approved if you'd just stayed in the county. And voila, go drive to Costco today and tell me what you see out there. So the city of Goleta, I would characterize them as, I wouldn't say they're development friendly, but I would say they're development neutral. And, on several projects we've worked on out there recently, they've been pretty helpful. Their senior staff is really helpful. The entry-level staff just aren't really experienced, so you almost always end up dealing with the senior level staff out there. But the nice thing about the city of Goleta is that they've got a recently adopted zoning ordinance that everybody's familiar with because it's brand new, and it was developed sort of to address modern problems and issues. And so that simplifies things in a way. And so I like it. And I also feel like the city of Goleta They were one of the people who got out ahead of the short-term rental issue and came up with rules for those before anybody had to sue them and go to appeals court. And they came up with really reasonable accessory dwelling unit regulations sort of early. And then when the state updated them, City of Goleta was one of the first places they actually updated their ADU regulations before the deadline from the state. And so I've been pretty impressed with things like that. And I'm sort of I'm optimistic about how things will go in Goleta going forward.
Thanks, Jarrett. Just again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us forward kind of on a fast track here, because we also want to get to the members' questions that are coming forward in the chat. For both of you, and I'll let you defer to you as to who wants to take a lead on this. Our next issue is areas of town, HOAs, planned developments. What are the key differences with these types of properties? And again, we just have to watch the time because there are 2 additional items I'd like to get to before we go to member questions.
I can go ahead and start, and I'll just bat it over to you, Jarrett. I would say that this is very similar to the question right before it, when we think about different areas and different communities, and those community plans that are kind of tacked on to the county or the city or Goleta. Whenever you see additional material, for example, a Montecito community plan or a CC&R for an HOA or condominium park place or anything like that. Anytime you see that additional layer of information, you always have to consider whichever piece of information is the most strict, is the most limiting. That's the one that you need to follow. And unfortunately, I have seen this quite a bit where there are associations, for example, and they would like to develop their property, and they go to the county and they figure out the rules, or maybe they hire a planner and figure it all out and they have a proposal, and then they have to go through their own HOA. This happens really commonly in Hope Ranch, for example, or Park Highlands area above Cathedral Oaks, just to list a few. Hope Ranch is a huge, huge community. They have their own set of guidelines in addition to the fact that you're in the county of Santa Barbara. And so the county will expect the HOA to provide like a letter or something that they've already done their review before it, either with or prior to any type of Board of Architecture review, so that there doesn't end up being a conflict somewhere down the line. The conflict will always end up landing back on the owner. So it's really important that if you are working with a association, an HOA, or a community plan, that you're always looking at the most strict. And there's no exception to that. You can't just say, well, the county said this. Well, it doesn't matter. The CC&Rs will beat it, or vice versa. A lot of the times, more often than not, actually, the CC&R is far looser. And they're like, well, you know, this doesn't apply to us. Well, it does, because at the end of the day, you have to get a permit from the county in this particular instance, or from the city.
Yeah,
Jarrett,
so I'm going to jump in. Yeah, so this isn't just in Hope Ranch.
And that was just an example.
It's in Hope Ranch is a great example because it's one of the most formal ones, and it's got almost its whole own county government on itself. Yep. But there's a lot of places where there isn't something like that, and you still have these CC&Rs, and they're just as much of an issue. So here's my advice to you. You guys get a title report on every single transaction.
Right.
I'm assuming everyone reads them, especially the Schedule B title exceptions. And if there are deed restrictions on a property, if your title company is doing its job, they will show up as an exception. And I would tell everybody, especially your buyer clients, get those CC&Rs, get the actual document and read that whole document and make sure that they're cool with everything in there, because there's stuff in CC&Rs that goes way beyond anything that the county or the city would ever have in their own regulations, but it might have a direct impact on what your buyer wants to do with that property. And it overrides everything. It is a private land use regulation. And when somebody has opted by deed to impose restrictions on themselves, that restriction applies and it trumps everything else. So make sure you're reviewing those things and that you're familiar with the standards and the allowed uses and everything else by your CCNRs. And I believe that, you know, it's your duty as an agent representing a buyer to read those and identify stuff that could be an issue for your client. You've got expertise understanding those kind of things that your average buyer just doesn't have. And it's really important that you do that.
Thank you, Jarrett and Roxana. I'm going to move us to the last item because we want to save room in our forum for the questions, and we also have a raffle at the end of the forum. So let's, to both of you, Jarrett, why don't you pick up where you left off, share with the members a bit about timeframes and costs for permitting. And as you can see, some of the questions are on ADUs, but tell us what commonly comes your way with clients, and then we'll also turn it over to Roxana.
So I'm gonna give you a consultant's favorite answer, which is it depends. Okay, there are no two things that are alike in permitting in terms of times or costs. I can have a 3-acre property and do a lot split to make it into 3 1-acre properties, and you might own the 3-acre property next door to me. And when you go in to do a 3-way lot split, your experience may differ. It's going to be different than mine. It could be radically different than mine, dependent on things like, you know, is there a specific constraint on your property that I didn't have, down to the staff person that got assigned to you. It is never the same. As you get to simpler and simpler projects, or at least the ones that you think are simpler, you know, once somebody like me has done, you know, 25 of these projects, I begin to get an idea of what these things can cost. And so like accessory dwelling units are a great example, because they're something that we've had a lot of recently, and they're subject to some very specific regulations that are, because they come from the state, they're consistent across jurisdictions. So I can tell you with accessory dwelling units, you know, the typical cost for a new detached accessory dwelling unit, if it's us that's doing it, and we do all the architecture and everything in-house, you know, we can do those for $20,000 usually, or a little less. Whereas, you know, if you're converting an existing portion of a house into an ADU, that's going to be a lot less complex, and therefore it's cheaper. So those can run like, you know, $8,000. But then again, you know, the city may throw some crazy thing into it that increases your cost. But, you know, in general, they're those types of costs. Fixing minor zoning violations, what may appear minor to you may not be minor at all. You know, I've had clients look at me and say, I don't understand. Why does this cost so much? All we're doing is moving a wall. Well, moving a wall is a huge deal, depending on, you know, what your situation is. It could be completely structural. It could generate thousands of dollars of costs, and, you know, just costs in terms of calculations and things you have to do. And so it's really hard to tell just at the outset how much are things going to cost. But, you know, if it's a simpler project, it'll be faster and cost less. If it's something that your neighbors are going to care about, something as minor as an addition to your house, it's going to cost more if the neighbors have a say. If you require design review, it's going to cost a lot more. So I can really only give it to you in relative terms like that, unless it's a very specific project, like an accessory dwelling unit.
Thanks. Roxana, would you like to add before we now turn to member questions?
Yes, definitely. I wanted to make sure that it's clear when we talk about how much is it going to cost, we're literally talking about the permitting process. We're not even talking about construction and materials and so on, and all the things that might pop up during that experience. For me, one of the things that I've learned in my practice is that as Jarrett said, he couldn't be more accurate. Every project is very different, but a lot of the times there will be certain kinds of reports that you don't expect to have to ask for. So like geotechnical reports or arborist reports or soils, because the structure may be compromised and you're trying to do an addition and it can't handle the weight, the load of a second story being converted to an ADU. Well, the second story used to be an attic and it wasn't designed for human load. And so you all of a sudden have to bring on new team members and get a structural engineer or a soils engineer and so on. And so you might not know going into it, well, it's just an ADU. Well, my neighbor just got an ADU. It's not a big deal. Well, it depends on where you're putting it. Depends on your topography, the slope, the structure itself, and how it was designed. You know, building codes evolve over time, and what may have been the building code at the time where your house was built may have changed by the time the neighbor did their project. And so there's so many variables, and I don't need to go into any further detail, but just to say that question is so challenging, and it's really, really a cruel question to try to ask or to receive an answer, because there's no way that you will walk away with a comfortable response. There's just no way.
Thank you, Roxana.
Mhm.
Now what I'm going to do, in the interest of time, is I'm going to scroll back up and start to look at the questions. I think you began answering, and maybe we have already. Darren asked about the permitting costs for ADUs currently in Santa Barbara. Could you just, in a sentence, maybe give a quick range of costs, so then I can keep moving through the questions for us?
Yeah, sure. You know, anywhere between $6,000 and $750,000. I mean, there's sort of the fees that I mentioned before. In the city, it's generally like our cost to design it and get it approved for you are probably going to be around $20,000 for a detached, brand new, because you're really building a new little house from scratch. And on the other ones, it'll be less. Permit costs on a new detached ADU of around 800 square feet. I'm seeing those come in, they could be about $10,000 in city permit fees for that. And again, people are like, oh no, $10,000 is so much. It's like, well, you're building a house. You're building an 800 square foot or $1,000 new house, and $10,000 in fees for that. The construction costs on something like that might be $300,000+ $10,000 is not really a significant amount of permit fees, but that's where it runs in that sort of a range.
Jarrett, let's stick with that and with you. Darren has a related second question. If a buyer purchases a home within a legal ADU, it's his understanding that with the new laws, the city of Santa Barbara must give time to get it permitted as an ADU before citing a violation. Is that correct? And if so, how much time are they given?
That's not correct. There's no restriction on them from they have to wait to cite you as a violation until you come and permit it. What happens with that and with any violation is the city cites you with a violation, and then they don't fine you, and they won't fine you unless you just don't do anything about it. So if they say, hey, you've got this illegal unit out here, that's a violation, you have to fix it, and they'll open an enforcement case, because that's one of the types of violations that will always generate an enforcement case. As long as you start working on it, you're never going to get a fine. In fact, if you're actively processing it, you'll probably never even get another nasty letter from them. They don't want your money in fines, and your money won't satisfy them either, because they'll keep fining you, and then they'll take you to court if you don't fix things. They want you to fix the thing. They want you to get it permitted. So if you're working to get it permitted, you're totally okay. And it doesn't really matter whether they have to wait to cite it or not.
Thanks, Jarrett. I'll open this next one up to either one of you. Michael asks, does inquiring with the planning department cause them then to look more closely at your property? For example, you call attention to the property, question mark, you find a problem that is not fixable. What happens? Do you have to tear down the addition? Who would like to comment on that? And then I'm going to go to the next question that goes to Jarrett from Kalia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that. I'm sorry, I can't see it clearly. Kalia or Kalia?
Roxana, you want to take that one real quick, and then I'll also take
Yeah,
it.
your answer might be different than mine. From my experience, maybe I've just been lucky. When I go in to ask a question and sort of do the off the record questions, they don't go like, as soon as I walk out of the room, they don't go and like file a complaint or, you know, flag a property. They're not supposed to do that. So I would like to believe that they don't do that regularly, and they don't do that just because you go in and ask them a question. On the other hand, it's really important to know that it can happen. I've heard this happening in all jurisdictions, where someone might just drive by a property and see something that clearly doesn't look right, and they'll go look it up, and they might flag it for a violation. But they don't do that because you come in. They're not supposed to do that because you ask questions. That's supposed to be basically good faith right there. Jarrett?
Yeah, and I'd say my experience is consistent, and they just have too much stuff going on to like write down that you mentioned something about a property. I'll tell you that the other thing that I always do though is, unless there's a compelling reason to have to tell them an address, I usually don't. I ask questions in general terms. Like, I've got a client who, you know, this is his zoning. He wants to do this. I think something looks a little weird about it. What would you think in this case? Mm-hmm. And, you know, most planning questions don't require an address. They require, you have to know what the zoning is, and you have to be able to articulate what it is you're asking the question about. So that's how I handle it most of the time. And then in other cases, you really do need to tell them the address, because there will be some really specific thing that we need to look at together on an aerial photo or something. And my general experience with them is that they just want to help get you the information, and they're not going to come after you. And really, the county and the city, they're complaint based on zoning violations. So really, unless somebody shows up and files a complaint that they then investigate, it's probably not going to happen.
Thank you both. And since you've already touched on carpentry and Goleta, I'm going to skip over those questions. So pardon me, members, but again, in the interest of time. And to Marcella, who this is her first question, how long does an ADU permit take to get nowadays? Is the time frame the same in different communities?
Do you want me to try?
Yeah, no, it is not. I will tell you that it's totally different in different communities. The county of Santa Barbara, they basically just gave up and said, hey, you know what, we're just going to comply with state law and do these reviews quickly like we're supposed to and get you your permit. The city of Santa Barbara has, since day one, sought out the most creative, you know, schemes possible to avoid complying with state law. And we call it the no backsies policy in my office. You submit an application and it's deemed incomplete. Like, doesn't matter what you submit, it's always deemed incomplete. And every subsequent submittal, they will deem that incomplete too, up to the day they actually issue your permit, because by doing that, they are claiming that they don't have to comply with the 60-day requirement under state law to give you a permit. And they've tried some really shady things. And one of my clients who has multiple projects, we sued them on 9 projects, and they offered to settle all 9 with us. So they're like a crooked insurance company that just denies all claims unless you sue them, and then they'll pay your claim, but they'll only pay your claim. They'll still hose everybody else. So yes, it is totally different depending on where you are. And City of Carpinteria, for those who are interested, they claim they are exempt from state law. They won't even accept an ADU application, which is completely breaking state law. So if any of you guys have a client who is willing to sue the City of Carpinteria and wants an ADU, call me. I'd be very happy to help you.
Well, with that lively answer, I'm also going to go to Stan, who asks, if an owner goes to the city to get a permit, does staff still want to see the street file, which may include an old ZIR with violations on it?
Go for it, Jarrett. That one's yours.
Yes. It's not that they want to, it's a standard part of their review procedure when you've submitted a permit is for them to review existing plans and permits for that property. They'll always do it. They do it because that's just standard due diligence when they're looking at a new thing, is to see what was there before. You know, it works both ways. Sometimes it can create a problem for you. Sometimes they may find out that very rarely, but in some cases, you know, we thought we needed a certain permit for something, and they found something that we hadn't found, or they interpreted something different than I did, and said, you know what, you actually don't need to go through that process. We saw something here that this looks like it was, you know, approved. Not in the normal way, but we deem it approved from what was there before. So you don't need this permit. So they always review it. You should count on the fact that they're going to review it, especially previous ZIRs, because those things called out things of interest. But just because they saw it in a previous ZIR doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to say it's still a problem. Because again, sometimes things were just identified that just really weren't legitimate violations, and they're paying much closer attention to that now than when they wrote those ZIRs.
I'm going to wrap us up here on questions with Teo's question, and then we're going to go to the raffle from Montecito Bank and Trust. So Teo asks, how about permitting process in areas where the Coastal Commission has jurisdiction?
Well, I can use the answer that we shared earlier about when you have multiple different ordinances or rules that all sort of overlap. You always have to go with the strictest one. And in most cases, the Coastal Commission will have, or the coastal zone will have the strictest zoning. They also have additional review checkpoints along the way. And so the bottom line is that you always have to double and triple check what is the rule applying to the community you're in, and how the overlays of Coastal Commission and their rules might apply. And also think about, your coastal development plan, the kind of application you're applying for. It's very different than inland areas looking at an LUP, for example. Some things are identical and other things are going to be stricter. So you're always following the most strict of the list.
And I would just say it's a very common misunderstanding, but anywhere around here, you're never going to be before the Coastal Commission.
Right.
Every jurisdiction here has an adopted local coastal plan, which means the Coastal Commission approved our rules and they said, now you handle it. You've got your own rules. You guys handle it. So even in the coastal zone, the final person that, the final agency that reviews your project is going to be the city of Santa Barbara or the county of Santa Barbara or the city of Goleta or Carpinteria. That's where it goes unless somebody appeals you to Coastal Commission, which can happen, but it's a really narrow appeal scope. So generally, if you're in the coastal zone, don't say, oh, this is, has to get Coastal Commission approval, because it doesn't. There's almost no cases where you will ever see or talk to the Coastal Commission.
Well, thank you, Jarrett and Roxana.